In 1976, George Lucas walked into 20th Century Fox's offices and asked them to pay him less money. Fox had offered him $500,000 to direct his next film, but Lucas turned Fox down. Even crazier, he asked for $150,000 instead, $350,000 less than what they offered him. In exchange, Lucas wanted three things that Fox didn't think were worth anything: the sequel rights to a science fiction film that hadn't even shot yet, the merchandising rights to the characters in a movie that didn't even exist, and the complete licensing rights to a universe that lived only inside George Lucas's head. Fox signed the contract, giving away the most valuable handshake in entertainment history. 30 years later, that same contract would be worth $4 billion. The question is how? As a 32-year-old director in 1976, see something that an entire studio missed completely. To figure that out, we have to walk through 4 decisions George Lucas made between 1973 and 2012. Phase 1, the bet nobody else would make. Before we get to Star Wars, we have to understand why Lucas was even in a position to negotiate at all. In 1976, George Lucas released a low-budget coming-of-age film called American Graffiti. It had no special effects, no major stars, and even Lucas himself was an unknown. Universal had financed it for around $770,000. Nobody at the studio thought it would do much, but the film made over $140 million worldwide. That's a return of roughly 180 to 1. American Graffiti became one of the most profitable films in Hollywood history. Lucas had negotiated a small percentage of the profits, and that percentage paid him about $4 million. By 1973, at only 29 years old, he was already a millionaire. But here's what mattered more than the money. American Graffiti proved something to the studios. It proved that Lucas's instincts about audiences were worth listening to. The next time he walked into a studio office, they had to take him seriously. Lucas used that leverage immediately. He took $300,000 of his American Graffiti earnings and started developing the next project. He'd been thinking about it for years. A space opera inspired by Akira Kurosawa samurai films he'd watched as a kid. The name he gave it was Star Wars. Universal passed, and Disney wasn't interested in distribution, but eventually 20th Century Fox said yes, mostly because a young executive named Alan Ladd Jr. believed in George Lucas personally. Fox was not excited about the script. Nobody was. They thought it was confusing and science fiction was a dead genre, but they signed. And this is where the story gets interesting. They offered George Lucas a standard package, $500,000 to direct, plus a small back-end percentage of the box office. In exchange, Fox would own everything else: the film, the characters, the merchandise, the sequels, and the licensing. That was protocol. Every major director signed deals like this. Coppola did it, Scorsese did it, Spielberg did it. Lucas said no. He told his lawyer Tom Pollock and his agent Jeff Berg to go back to Fox with a counterproposal. He'd accept a smaller directing fee. In exchange, he wanted 3 rights that Fox didn't care about. He wanted sequel rights to anything in the Star Wars universe, full ownership of all merchandising and licensing revenue, and he wanted profit participation that scaled with the film's success rather than capped out at a fixed percentage. Fox's logic was simple. Sequel rights to a science fiction film were worthless because science fiction films didn't get sequels in 1976. The genre was considered a one-and-done category. Lucas's logic was different. He wasn't pricing the rights based on what science fiction had done before. He was pricing them based on what he believed the film could become. He'd spent 3 years building out the Star Wars universe in his head. The contract was signed. Fox got their discount and Lucas got the rights. He'd just made the most lopsided trade in entertainment history, and not a single person in the world, or in the building certainly, knew it. Phase 2. How the machine actually worked. Star Wars came out on May 25th, 1977. It was supposed to be a moderate hit. The film made $460 million in its initial release. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $2.5 billion in today's money. It was the highest grossing film in history at the time by any means. And by the way, the film, it had been made for just $11 million. Lucas's directing fee from that box office success would have been substantial under any normal contract. But here's where the rights deal he negotiated in 1976 stopped being theoretical and started becoming the most valuable contract in Hollywood history, because the box office was just the beginning. In 1977, a small toy company called Kenner signed a licensing deal with Lucasfilm. They'd manufacture and sell Star Wars action figures, vehicles, and playsets. Kenner would handle production, distribution, retail, and inventory risk. Lucasfilm would collect a royalty on every unit sold. In the first 18 months, Kenner sold approximately 100 $100 million worth of Star Wars toys. By 1985, that number had crossed $1.5 billion. By the end of the original trilogy, Star Wars merchandise had generated over $4 billion in retail sales alone, with Lucasfilm collecting royalties on every single transaction. But the merchandising deal wasn't even the most strategic part of what George Lucas built. While the toy money was flowing in, he used that cash to build something that would prove even more durable. In 1975, before Star Wars had even started filming, Lucas had a problem. He needed visual effects that didn't exist yet. The shots he'd designed for the film, the space battles, the lightsabers, the Death Star sequences, were beyond the technical capabilities of any existing studio effects house. He'd asked around and had been told it couldn't be done. So he built his own company. He rented a warehouse in Van Nuys, California, hired a small team of young technicians without major industry credentials, and called the operation Industrial Light and Magic. ILM was supposed to be a temporary project, one film effects house that would dissolve after Star Wars wrapped. It became something much more valuable. After Star Wars came out, every other major studio in Hollywood realized they needed visual effects at a level only ILM could deliver. Steven Spielberg used ILM for Raiders of the Lost Ark. Robert Zemeckis used ILM for Back to the Future. James Cameron used ILM for Terminator 2 and The Abyss. It was used in The Matrix. Over the next 4 decades, ILM would work on more than 300 major films across every studio in the industry. And every one of those studios was paying Lucasfilm. Lucas built ILM out of necessity, but once it existed, it became the tool set that every Hollywood studio depended on. By the late 1990s, the Wall Street Journal estimated ILM's annual revenue at around $180 million. By 2023, ILM's UK studio alone reported over $1 billion in revenue. Not to mention the 16 Academy Awards and hundreds of franchises built on its technology. And then there's Skywalker Sound. Lucas needed audio post-production for Star Wars, built the facility internally, and then opened it to outside clients. It got 80+ Academy Award nominations across decades of work for other studios. Another revenue stream that operated independently of any Star Wars film or the franchise. By the early 1980s, the structure was complete. Lucas had 3 things working in parallel: the merchandise royalties from a brand he owned outright, the infrastructure revenue from ILM and Skywalker Sound serving every major studio and film, and the box office backend from films he was about to start financing himself. The last piece is where the story shifts from clever to historic. If you want to see how other operators use the exact same system to build 9-figure empires, hit subscribe. On this channel, we stop looking at celebrities as entertainment and start analyzing the money systems behind them. Every single week, we break down how operators, celebrities, entrepreneurs build institutional wealth from unconventional starting points. So make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Phase 3, the move that changed Hollywood. By 1979, Lucas had a problem that most people would call a great problem. He had too much money. The original Star Wars had generated enough cash that Lucasfilm was no longer dependent on studio financing for sequels. Lucas had something almost no other director in Hollywood had ever achieved. He had operational independence. So when it came time to make Empire Strikes Back, Lucas walked into Fox's office with a proposal nobody had ever made before. He told them he'd finance the entire film himself. Fox wouldn't put up a single dollar of production capital. In exchange, Fox would handle distribution. They'd get a fee for that work, but Lucas would own the film outright, the sequel, and the sequel, and every sequel after that, and every dollar of profit that came in from them. Most people who hear this story think it's about a director getting a better cut. It's not. It's about the fundamental restructuring of who owned the asset. Under the traditional studio deal, the studio puts up the money, the studio owns the film, and the director gets a percentage. Under Lucas's deal, the director put up the money, the director owned the film, and the studio got a fee for distribution. The roles had completely flipped. Lucas used the cash flow from his own IP to buy out the middleman. He didn't need Fox's capital anymore, so Fox lost their seat at the table. They could either accept a distribution fee or walk away from the most valuable franchise in Hollywood history. They took the fee. Empire Strikes Back made $547 million in worldwide box office. Return of the Jedi made $475 million. Both films were owned outright by Lucasfilm. Fox collected their distribution percentage and watched Lucas keep everything else. By the end of the trilogy, Lucas was not a director anymore. He was running a vertically integrated entertainment company with 3 independent revenue streams, complete IP ownership, and one of the most valuable franchises in the industry. For 41 years, from 1971 to 2012, Lucasfilm operated as a single-owner private company. Because of that same independence, the same total control that let Lucas build everything was about to cost him the single most valuable opportunity of his entire career. Phase 4, the billion-dollar mistake. mistake. In June of 1983, the same month Return of the Jedi was breaking box office records, George Lucas's marriage ended. His wife, Marcia Lucas, had been an editor on Star Wars. She'd shared an Academy Award for her work on the film. They'd been together since film school. The divorce settlement, depending on which source you trust, was somewhere between $35 and $50 million, on a personal net worth of around $60 million at the time. The settlement consumed somewhere between 58 and 83% of his liquid wealth. This is the part of the Lucas story that almost never gets told properly, because what happened next was a financial decision made under genuine cash pressure, and it would end up costing him more than the divorce settlement itself by several orders of magnitude. Inside Lucasfilm, there was a small division called Computer Graphics Group. It had been started in 1979 to develop digital animation technology. The team was led by two researchers named Ed Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith. They were doing fundamental research into computer-rendered images, the kind of work that might become a real product in 5 or 10 years, but was burning cash with no near-term future. In 1986, with the divorce settlement still draining his balance sheet, Lucas decided to spin the division off. A young entrepreneur who went by the name of Steve Jobs, who had recently been forced out of Apple, agreed to capitalize the spin-out for $10 million. $5 million went to Lucasfilm in exchange for technology rights. The other $5 million capitalized the new company. Steve took 70% ownership and the management took 30%. On the other hand, Lucas kept zero equity. The new company, it was called Pixar. For the next decade, Pixar burned through cash. Jobs had to put in another $45 million of his own money to keep the company alive. By 1994, after employee dilution and additional rounds, Jobs owned 100% of Pixar and Lucas owned none. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story. It made over $360 million worldwide and changed the animation industry forever. Pixar went public that same year. Stock soared from $22 a share to $39 on the very first day of the offering. In 2006, Disney acquired Pixar for $7.4 billion in an all-stock transaction. Steve Jobs received the entirety of the proceeds as the 100% owner, and he became Disney's largest individual shareholder. George Lucas got nothing. If Lucas had retained a 10% stake in Pixar at the time of the spinout, the stake would be worth $740 million when Disney bought the company. A 20% stake would have been worth $1.5 billion. Even 5% would have been worth $370 million. He didn't keep anything. He kept zero. This is the most consequential single financial decision in Lucas's career. The Pixar deal didn't require him to put up more capital. It just required him to negotiate a small piece of the upside in case the spin-out turned into something. The lesson Lucas had taught Hollywood about the value of retained rights was the same lesson that he failed to apply to himself in 1986. But here's a strange thing about Lucas's story. The Pixar mistake didn't break the empire. It barely slowed it down, because the right structure he'd built around Star Wars was so durable that even a $1 billion opportunity cost couldn't derail what was coming next. Phase 5, the exit that made history. By the late 1990s, Lucas was ready to make Star Wars films again. He'd spent 15 years building Lucasfilm into something larger than just a production company. ILM had become the dominant visual effects house in Hollywood. Skywalker's sound was the industry standard for audio post-production, and the Star Wars trilogy he'd produced in the 1970s and 80s had become the most culturally durable entertainment franchise of the 20th century. When he announced the prequel trilogy in the late 1990s, every major studio in Hollywood lined up to bid for distribution rights. Lucas chose Fox again, but on terms even more favorable than the original trilogy. The Phantom Menace came out in 1999 and made over $1 billion worldwide. Attack of the Clones in 2002, Revenge of the Sith in 2005, the combined box office across all three films was approximately $2.5 billion on a total production budget of around $345 million. The critical reception was a different story. Fans and critics savaged the prequels, the dialogue was clunky, and the CGI-heavy approach felt cold compared to the practical effects of the original trilogy. Lucas's reputation as a director had taken a hit in the public perception. He had had complete creative control with no studio executives, no producers, no editors above him, and the result was a body of work that was commercially massive but artistically divisive. The critical reception didn't matter to the IP value, though. The merchandise reignited at scale. The franchise's commercial momentum was the strongest it had been since the early 1980s. By 2005, Forbes ranked Lucas at number 61 on their list of wealthiest Americans, with a net worth of $3.5 billion. In 2006, Disney acquired Pixar, the company Lucas had spun off 2 decades earlier, for $7.4 billion. 3 years later, in 2009, 2009, Disney bought Marvel Entertainment for $4 billion. Both acquisitions were treated as expensive at the time, but both turned out to be among the most profitable deals in entertainment history. Lucas was watching this with a very specific lens. He owned a franchise larger than Marvel and arguably more valuable than Pixar. Disney had demonstrated twice that they were willing to pay a premium for IP-rich entertainment companies. They had the infrastructure to monetize that IP across theme parks, streaming, theatrical releases, publishing, and consumer products at a scale that Lucasfilm structurally couldn't match. In 2011, Disney CEO Bob Iger met Lucas for breakfast. Lucas was 67 years old. He'd been thinking about what would happen to Lucasfilm after he was gone. Formal negotiations began in early 2012. 8 months later, on October 30th, 2012, the deal closed. Disney paid about $5 billion for Lucasfilm, 55% in cash, 45% in Disney stock. Lucas owned a 100% stake in Lucasfilm. There were no other shareholders and no outside investors. Every single dollar of the sale price went directly to him. Compare that to almost any other entertainment company. DreamWorks SKG, founded by Steven Spielberg, went through public listings, multiple investor rounds, and complex ownership splits before being acquired by Paramount. By the time the dust settled, the original founders had captured a fraction of the total enterprise value. Spielberg himself, despite directing the highest-grossing films in history, never achieved a comparable single-owner exit because Amblin Partners always had outside investors. Lucas had spent 41 years refusing to take outside capital. The result was that when Disney finally arrived as a buyer, the asset they were buying was structurally pristine. 3 months later, in February of 2013, Lucas filed with the SEC to sell his Disney stock. He liquidated approximately $2 billion worth of shares. His total realized proceeds came to approximately $4 billion in cash, liquid wealth from a single rights negotiation he made 36 years earlier. Strip away the films, and what George Lucas actually built is a 4-step playbook that almost any creator, founder can apply. The first move was pricing what others didn't value yet. Fox priced the Star Wars merchandise rights at zero because no science fiction film had ever generated significant merchandise revenue. Lucas priced them at the cost of his directing fee because he could see what the franchise might become. The second move was building a royalty business, not a production business. Lucasfilms didn't make movies for other studios, it collected fees. Every single revenue stream that Lucas built was structured so that he was getting paid on top of someone else's operational work. That's the difference between a business that scales and a business that grinds. The third move was using cash flow to buy out the middleman. The merchandise royalties from Star Wars funded the self-financing of Empire Strikes Back. Self-financing Empire eliminated Fox's profit participation entirely. Lucas understood that the capital independence was worth more than any specific revenue stream. The fourth move was selling when the buyer's capacity exceeded his own. Lucas didn't sell Lucasfilm because he ran out of ideas. He sold because Disney could deploy the Star Wars IP across theme parks, streaming, publishing, and theatrical releases in ways that Lucasfilm structurally couldn't or didn't want to. The asset was worth more in Disney's hands, and Disney was willing to pay him for that gap. Now think about what that 1976 contract actually was. A 32-year-old director with no money and no leverage walked into the offices of one of the largest entertainment companies in the world and asked them to give him less money in exchange for rights that they thought were worthless. The only thing he had was a screenplay about space wizards and a willingness to bet on himself when nobody else would. The $4 billion that Disney paid in 2012 wasn't exactly the moment that George Lucas became wealthy. He had already become wealthy when he signed the contract in 1976. If you want more breakdowns of the deals that quietly built modern empires, hit subscribe. I'm Buster, and I'll see you on the next one.